Like I said, Exodus 13, we're beginning there at verse 17. There is, I don't know if you've seen this, but there is a person on Etsy. I think the name of it is Bible Sketches. I know I'm losing a couple of man card points by mentioning Etsy in the pulpit, but just go with me here. He does art like ink drawings of biblical scenes. This is actually one that Maya and the kids got for me at an unknown holiday in the last year. At some point, this happened. It's in my office. I really like it. To appreciate it, you kind of have to get close to it. If you get close to the boat in the middle, you see there's a figure standing on the very front of it. That's Jesus, him calming the storm, and sort of kind of where that would have started. This is another one that I really like that the same artist did. This is the woman with the issue of blood who reaches and touches the hem of Jesus' garment, and she's made whole. There's that idea. I like this one too. This is the prodigal son. You can see the prodigal son's in black and his head's down, but then the father's running down the hill to welcome him, and that sort of thing. I bring all that up because the background art that we've used so far in our Exodus study has been from this picture. It might look familiar. And what's being depicted, I just love the angle that this portrays. It looks as if it's a people walking underwater, which, looking at it from the side, that's probably what it would have looked like. The words that are used to describe Israel passing through the Red Sea are really interesting. If you look in Exodus 14, when it says, and look closely at verses 22, well, specifically verse 22, when it describes the waters being a wall to them on their left and on their right, kind of like we would, they had different words for different types of walls. The wall that's described is like a city wall. It's an enormous wall. It's not like a retaining wall in your front yard, right? Something that you can just step over. The word that's used there is specifically for like a very tall wall that you could not just climb over, as in like the walls of Jericho, like when they fell. Same kind of idea. Israel passed through the Red Sea, and the water was a wall to them on their left and on their right. The only thing this picture doesn't get right, other than the fact that there probably aren't whales in the Red Sea, is Israel marching single file. This was not done single file. That would have taken months. This was done in mass as a group, but it is a compelling picture. I thought so. Okay, you had the chance to look hopefully at the text, the rest of chapter 13 and all of chapter 14. I just wanted to hear first what stood out to you, what you found interesting, what you found different, something you didn't see before. Megan?
So it's kind of a question and an observation.
Okay.
So in 14 verse 8 at the end, well, basically it says, the Lord hardened the heart of Pharaoh, king of Egypt, and he chased after the sons of Israel as the sons of Israel were going out boldly.
Right.
I have in my notes in my Bible that I took, so I don't know if this is correct. Like, when it says boldly, does that mean they were confident that God was taking care of them? Like, what does that mean, boldly? Like, I mean, I know what the word boldly
Mine, you talking about the very end of verse 9 or verse 8?
Yeah.
Mine has defiantly, which might mean in regard to their treatment of Pharaoh, right? They went out in defiance of him.
Okay.
And what he, had repeatedly stated he didn't want them to do, and then, of course, relented and let them go at least long enough for them to escape. But I take that as defiant of him, is sort of that.
But either way, though.
But it is a good thing to notice, for sure.
Either way, the context is still kind of the same in my observation. But just like you look at that, in verse 8, and then like, I know it's versus time, but then you look, and then right away after in verse 10, they're getting scared already. They're like taking off, and then they're like scared. And I don't know what the time frame is, but.
Someone made a very interesting point about the Israelites seeing the Egyptians approach, and then they decided to have fear. I don't remember which commentator it was. But Israel was told that this would happen, right? They were told early on that the Egyptians would pursue them and that they would be, they would be destroyed. And the commenter made the point, Israel seeing the Egyptians, yes, it filled them with fear, but it also could have been an opportunity for them to go, God said this was going to happen. God said they were going to run after us. If they didn't run after us, that'd be a problem, right? Because if God said so and they didn't, then what? At least them seeing Egypt approach meant, wait, God said this would happen, and it's happening in that way. Now, it's terrifying to look at, the equivalent of a squadron of F-16s flying your way. This is the height of military technology. This is, all of the Panzers coming over the hill, right? If you're talking about World War I, World War II, that kind of thing. This is serious business. They had every right from a human perspective to be terrified of this, but yet at the same time, God told them this is exactly how it was going to go. And so an opportunity for them to have faith in him there. All right, other stuff you saw when you read through the chapter. There's a lot there between 13 and 14. Yeah.
It struck me again, I don't know if you call it the fickleness or the unbelief or whatever of the Hebrews. They've just lived through, they've seen what God can do and what it did to this extremely powerful nation, this extremely powerful king, and yet they've only gone a few miles and they're complaining, you just brought us out here to die. We were so much better off back home,
Yes.
Forgot about gathering their own straw and making bricks and the Pharaoh killing their children and everything else. And just, we look at them in the wilderness and we think, they're complaining again. We started out.
Yeah. The word that came to my mind when you started describing it was the fragility.
Yeah.
And don't they make this same complaint later in the wilderness? The same idea of why have you brought us out here to die? Would have been better off in Egypt. I think that instance is different from this instance. I don't think it's excused in either case. But at least in this early instance, they are just barely brand new out of Egypt. This just began. Versus later on, they've been walking with God for quite a while. Right? They've been to Sinai. They've gotten the law. They've gotten some experience with God. They've seen other things. And then when it got hard, they did the same thing again. So it's the same complaint, but I think it comes from two different Israels, you might say. Two different stages in their development. Mike?
You also have that Israel is in 430 years of slavery.
Right.
They're not seasoned warriors that are used to fighting battles.
Yep. Speaking of that was one thing I noticed that I don't know I had caught before. When God doesn't lead them through the land of the Philistines, it's because it says in verse 17 of chapter 13, lest they change their minds when they see war and return to Egypt. But how does it say they were equipped in verse 18? For battle or for war, right? So yes, they are a force, they are an army of sorts. No doubt they probably have weapons plundered from the Egyptians, but they're not ready. They're not ready at this stage to do any kind of fighting at any level, and so God will fight for them. And that's the language that's used there of God fighting against them like a man fights against another man. Is that He prevailed over them, He got glory over them, they died as a result. All right. What else you see? What else catches your eye?
But one of the things Mike, said they were there 430 years in slavery, and basically Joseph passed away at 110. I didn't go back and check how it was when he got there, but we're talking 300 years plus, and they still carry his bones out of Egypt. I think that's
Yes.
kind of significant.
It's absolutely significant. This made me think, okay, sometimes you read the Bible and something funny pops in your head. Like, what did he have them in? I know that's completely irrelevant, but you can imagine Joshua. I don't know how old Joshua was. I don't think he was a child. But Joshua goes into Moses' tent. Hey, what's that? Oh, those are Joseph's bones. I mean, were they in a box? Were they in a bag? I don't know. But it's like he seems to have had them. And then at some point later, he had to have given them to, maybe he gave them to Joshua's people. I don't know, because Moses didn't bury them in the land of Canaan. Someone else did. They were done after Joshua died. So somebody was in custody of these bones. Were they in I don't think they were hauling around like King Tut's sarcophagus, that kind of thing.
I mean, He was
Vietnam.
He was embalmed
I don't
in the
know,
after the
but
manner of the
he was
Egyptians,
an
but like what
important-
was the thing,
He was
you
an
know?
important Egyptian. I would have thought he would have been embalmed and in a sarcophagus of some sort, like the Egyptians did.
Right, but like how carrying that around seems. You don't want to be that guy, you know. You what did you haul around for 40 years? Joseph, you know. Yeah, he was embalmed. But like it makes you wonder like what was he in, that kind of thing. I don't know, just a thought. Some stuff you'll see again when the Bible repeats something, it's on purpose. In 14 and verse 4, when God explains to Moses, listen, I want you to go tell your people to go encamp by the sea. He says that twice, right? Between Migdol and the sea. And then in verse 2, encamp facing it by the sea. Go down and make camp on the beach, basically. Literally, paint yourself in a corner where you can't get out. And he says, I will get glory over Pharaoh and all his host. He says it again in verse 14, right? Or I'm sorry, not verse 14, verse 18. And the Egyptians shall know that I am the Lord when I have gotten glory over Pharaoh, his chariots, and his horsemen. However weighty or however significant or however meaningful Pharaoh thought that he was, God was going to show both he and all of Egypt, you have no idea, right? As to the weightiness, the glory, the heaviness of who God is, right? Pharaoh thinks he's the top dog. He's not even under the porch, right, from where this is.
I didn't know you were already playing into it, so I'm sorry if I take some of your wind.
No, go for it.
Speaking of wind, I thought it's always amazed me that the Israelites crossed on dry ground.
Yep.
Like that key detail that the wind was not only holding the sea, and you think about the power it would take to hold that kind of hydraulic pressure to split the Red Sea and hold it, and then in addition, dry the ground out without blowing them away, and they pass, and then everything shuts. It's like just if
The ground's dry enough for foot and animal traffic,
yeah, have you never ever
but not for
felt-
iron chariots. What's that?
Have you not ever felt what's on the bottom of a lake? You know what I mean? Like that nasty muck and everything.
Yeah.
Now it may be rock bottom in the Sea of Galilee. I don't know, or the Red Sea. I mean, but still, it just to think of the logistics of that happening. Like if you can't appreciate God's power, you know, this should.
Well,
show you.
we did get a detail in the text about the sea floor itself. In 14, 24, and 25, the Egyptians' chariot wheels drove heavily in it. So some have said, well, if the seabed is silt or something that's not that would inhibit foot traffic, but you go driving a several 100-pound iron chariot with its narrow wheels and the horses and the 3 armed men that are riding in it, that didn't go, right? There's a story later in Judges about that same sort of thing happening.
Well, it also says in 25, he took off the chariot wheels.
Yep. And it sort of 25. It sort of depends on how that's translated, whether the wheels came off or whether they were clogged. I know some are kind of both ways on that. Either way, it wasn't a chariot anymore; it was a boat anchor, right, with horses attached to it, and they realized that too late. I mentioned this point already. They were marched equipped for battle, but they weren't ready to fight. One of my favorite images in really, honestly, the Old Testament as a whole, is in chapter 14 and verse 19. So in 13 and verse 21, notice that the text says that the Lord went before them by day in a pillar of cloud. And then later in the text, he's described as an angel. Either way is significant to the point. This cloud of fire and of smoke, leads them, goes in front of them until they get to the Red Sea. They get to the Red Sea and they're trapped. Here comes the Egyptian army. So that same presence, that same cloud, fire, angel, God, whatever it is, goes around and he stands behind them and prevents, Egypt from attacking them all night. It's this image, I don't know, every time I see it in the movies, it's always this image of, the powerful person, like holding back some great force while some other people can be saved, right? The idea of the Lord standing between the two of them, stood behind them, it says in verse 19, coming between the two of them. I love that picture. It's really unique in Scripture that God says that he stood between two groups and refused to let them come together. Right? That's a really personal description of how he protected them.
I think it can also be helpful for us and probably them at the time to picture that God was already protecting him then.
Sure.
But then he also used his presence to stand between
Right.
the enemy and his people.
It's an object lesson to them for sure. He could have very easily just, prevented it from happening, but he chose to make it visible and make it obvious to them, which is it's a wonderful image. Yep.
Mentioned the cloud by day, the fire by night. And Hebrews chapter 8 and verse 9 always stood out to me because we see those visual things in the way God directed Israel, and yet God's looking at it by the hand, like a father takes a child, leads him out by the hand. To me, that seems so much more personal, but that's the heart of God, the way he took care of his children.
Yeah, he led them out by the hand, and then when the bad guy came, he stood between him and that person and his people. Love that image. When you read 10 through 12, the point I always like to make is never underestimate the weight of fear and despair, right? All's well and good until the Egyptian chariots are on their way, right? Now, these are a fragile, faith-wise people. They've been in slavery for a very long time. All this has kind of happened in sort of a whirlwind deliverance. Yes, it's easy from our position of safety to look at them and say, well, you silly Israelites, you should have had better faith. Try to put yourself there and think about it, what that would have felt like, what that would have looked like. To just be a little understanding of that. I don't know if this is true in your Bible. A couple commenters made the point from verses 30 and 31, the last two verses of chapter 14. When it says there in 31, I believe it is that, Yahweh saved Israel that day from the hand of Egypt, or from the hand of the Egyptians. It's the same sort of phrase used in 31 of the hand of Yahweh, although most of the times it's translated the great power that the Lord used against the Egyptians. But I think it's a contrast between Egypt's hand, which was weak and powerless, and God's hand, which was strong and excessively powerful. One, I think, neat thing you could see from that. Julia mentioned the bones of Joseph. This is a good sort of thread to follow through Scripture. I think it's mentioned 4 times. The first time in Genesis 50, Joseph made the sons of Israel swear, God will visit you. That doesn't mean he's coming over for tea. That means he's coming to save you. He's coming to deliver. He's coming to effect change in your situation. God will visit you and you'll carry up my bones from here. And then our text tonight, Exodus 13, they carried the bones. Joshua 24, after the death of Joshua, there's this reference of the bones of Joseph being buried at Shechem. And that piece of ground is important because it's the actual ground that belonged to Jacob. Right? Anywhere in Israel would have been, I guess, still Israelite territory, but they went back to Jacob's land, the land he bought before they went to Egypt. And they buried the bones there. And then that same reference is made in Hebrews 11. Out of all of the things you could have said in Joseph's life as a display of faith, it's the thing about his bones that's mentioned, right? And it's an interesting sort of thread to trace through there. When you look throughout the rest of the Old Testament and even into the New Testament, this is one of the most significant. This event, is mentioned so many times it's hard to even describe. In Joshua chapter 2, remember Rahab knew of this when the spies show up to spy out the city of Jericho. They knew this was, or no, I'm sorry, that's Joshua 6. I got that wrong, didn't I? She said the same thing. Yeah, Joshua 6. No, I got, hold on. Sorry, I'm discombobulated. Well, I got it right. Joshua 2, Rahab. Okay. Sorry. Sometimes you forget you know a thing. Joshua 2, Rahab's the one who knows that this has happened, so the report of this has spread elsewhere. We knew from the book of Judges that this had spread to Philistia as well. They knew of this event. It's repeated over and over and over again. It's used in 1 Corinthians 10 and Hebrews 11 as well. This I thought interesting. If you're reading through Exodus, this story gets not just the prose telling of it, or just sort of the narrative, here's what happened, there's what happened, but you get the telling of it in 13 and 14, and then if you read chapter 15, the Song of Moses, it's the same thing over again, but in poetry. That should tell us how important the event is. Not just that it's described more than once, but it's described in more than one type of literature side by side, right? And that's a significant thing. In fact, I hope we're going to take next week's class and just look at the poem itself from verses 1 to 18. I want to spend a little bit of time with that because it's something is normally not done. We're going to look at that, Lord willing, next week. It's important enough to get those two things. Now, talk about bookends in Scripture. In Exodus chapter 1, the chapter ends with Pharaoh ordering the drowning of all Israelite sons. Right? All the children, the male children born to Israel, are supposed to be thrown in the river, the Nile. How does the Egyptian chapter of Exodus end? It ends with God drowning the remaining sons of Egypt in the Red Sea. Right? As they did to God's people, God did to them. It's another version of God's promises, to Abraham. The one who blesses you will be blessed, and the one who curses you will be cursed. And often it's done in the same sort of fashion just to make that point. They tried to stand against God's people, and as a result, they stood against God, and God demonstrated that with this. Okay, what should they have done with it? This is their July 4th. This is their origin story event. What should an Israelite have done with this, reading through it? What lessons would have been impressed on them as a people? None. We go to chapter 15, right? It's just absolutely nothing. What do you think?
I have a comment for the last point on your other slide. Just
Okay.
real quick.
Fine. All right. There you go.
I also thought it was really interesting. One of the just nuanced details that we have is that the Egyptians drowned in the Red Sea, but then the Israelites could see the Egyptians on the shore after being killed, which is you can picture the what am I thinking? The symbolism to the Israelites after going through all of this, that they could see their enemies dead.
Right.
On the dry land, even though they died.
Right. Not just they're gone, but then they got to see evidence that they are actually truly gone. They didn't make it. And that would have been one way to prove that they didn't make it back across, because they tried to flee. And so when you see them dead on the seashore, that they didn't make it. Lots and lots and lots of them didn't make it there. All right, back to our question. What should Israel have done with it? What are the big lessons they would have learned reading this later, teaching this to their own children? What stands out?
Should be evident from this that God has power to save and will save his people. The other piece I think is interesting about this is, Moses was known for being mean.
Mm-hmm.
That he allowed things to happen, God would vindicate them, he didn't need to make a point for himself. God does make a point for himself.
Yes.
It's not just that he saved them, he could have just saved them, but he says, I want you to turn back and we're going to make sure that God is glorified by how this happened. God makes it.
Yeah. He will. Have you ever heard the person, and I won't, they use the phrase, keep my name out of your mouth. It's the idea that my name is more important than you being able to mention it, right? You don't have the right to talk about me like that because I am, above you. God is adding weight to his name, right? Just in the same way that the plagues added weight to his name, that deliverance added weight to his name, This adds weight to his name that echoes even now. He did that. Like, I mean, what sort of power has to be involved to split a body of water and let your people walk through for several hours while you just, oh, by the way, make sure that the, Egyptian army can't attack while all this is going on. And then only when it's only when you're good with it, okay, now you can come across. And, oh, look, you're in the middle. Just the power behind that is astounding. He's adding weight to his name with that. I will get glory over him. That's what the word glory means. It's heaviness, it's weight, it's honor, significance to that. All right? Yeah.
Is there any historical evidences that show implications of the fact that the army, it says all of the army was completely wiped out, and Pharaoh, it makes it appear that Pharaoh was wiped out. But historically, that had to have had an effect on them and the magnitude of what happened.
It's one of those things, if you survive this in Egypt, this is not something that you want to talk about. This isn't something that you want to inscribe on your pyramid and go, hey, you remember that time we were totally embarrassed by Yahweh, and because they tended to do, history is told by either the victor or the survivor, right? And in this case, this is not something that's written in their own history. There is some debate as to whether or not Pharaoh went with them literally and died with them. Whether he did or whether he didn't, I'm not sure. There's always an interesting documentary that comes out every few years saying, we found proof, right? We found a chariot wheel, or we found something. And I don't know that any of those have produced anything tangible, but yeah, in terms of evidence outside the Bible, if there is some, I'm not very aware of it. There may be. Mike, are you aware of anything like that?
I have no knowledge of any. Even the geography is hard to.
That's the tough part too. What part of the sea was it?
Yeah.
You know.
And the only thing you've got is, it seems that this happened in a relatively short period of time.
Mm-hmm.
I'm not saying a whole day.
Right.
So it must have been a place where the waters that they crossed took an hour, 2 hours, or something like that. And that's the only identified mark, because we've had the
Yeah.
Suez Canal, I think, over there now, so we wouldn't have any way of.
Yeah. Everything that they would have had on, or the chariot components they've been gone for centuries at this point. Derek, did you have a? And then I saw you back there.
It's kind of the final blow, because
It is.
it's now losing its army. You consider all the plagues before that, so the enterprise that was Egypt is completely destroyed, and now you have no way to defend yourself. You haven't probably made a lot of friends with your neighbors,
Yeah.
and you're gonna need help. And you just look at it as a whole, they are completely vulnerable where the Israelites started in that state, and now Egypt is left with that.
It's a wonder there's anything left at all of their society and of what it was. It does show you the size and the power of the nation of Egypt, that they could suffer something like this and keep going, right? I mean, it's pretty remarkable they were able to do that. Sean, did you have a thought?
Maybe more on the application side.
Oh, that's okay. Well, that's where this goes anyway, so you're good.
If you think about their reaction to them seeing the tricks, but it's, you think about the general aspect of the perspective. Certain promises were made to them as a people. Certain promises were made to us by God as a people.
Mm-hmm.
So it's often easy to have faith in the broad picture, but then specifically, how does it apply to me as I'm staring at this chariot coming to me? We're not guaranteed life and health and happiness in this life
Yeah.
from God. So there may be bad things that come our way, and Scripture's filled with faithful people during hard things. I guess
it's, you can understand the difficulty of, for them to be saved, it was impossible. They're stuck. And that's precisely why Pharaoh chased them. He says, they're wandering around in the wilderness. They're stuck. They can't cross the sea. Well, we've got them. There's no way out. They had to learn to trust in a God that would do things that were impossible. And we shouldn't be surprised whenever they had trouble with that, right? Think about that with us, right? None of us knows when we are going to die. And yet we are trusting in a God who has said he will do something impossible, which is resurrection. And that's all well and good when everything's great every day. But when you see death approaching and the things start to happen, you start having to remember you have to put your faith in a God that does impossible things and be able to trust him through all that. We are as trapped, if not more so, than they were. Just by that. We have to do the same thing. Yeah.
All these plagues that they could see God, but yet Israelites said, well, why are we landing here to die? And then we get into the next chapter, why are we in the wilderness? Providing for them to toil. And I mean, it's interesting. We get the same way. We get whiny and weepy about things and question God's power, but yet we read this. And we think, again, how he split the sea like that.
The Egyptians saw it for what it was immediately. Granted, they got a real painful lesson in evidences. You might say full immersion in evidences, but it's what happens when you're on the wrong side of the thing. Did you have a thought?
I would say, we think of Egypt by Egypt today, but in the 15th century BC, that was the United States.
Absolutely.
I mean, it was the dominating power of all the nations. And your God was with you from bed. You take care of the other nations too.
Yep. Let's see. God waited until the most dominant nation in the world had control of his people before he decided to save them. Does that sound familiar? That's Jesus and the Roman Empire, guys. The most dominant world empire that the world had ever seen up to that point. And it's at that very moment when God says, okay, we're going to start right here with Jesus. And then we're going to go from there. Yep.
Even in the face of these amazing, miraculous things that happen. And so we look at verse 5, when Pharaoh and the officials change their mind and say, what have we done? We've released Israel and served us. I mean, you were just begging them to leave
Right.
days ago, something like that, because of the first storm throughout the entire country. And all of the miracles that have happened before that, just really bringing up for them and for me, think of secularly as the sunk cost fallacy, like the for a penny in for a pound, if
Mhm.
I already lost $50, that's significant, so I'm gonna put 5 more in to try to redeem that 50, and the lesson from Pharaoh that I see here is that quit when you're behind.
Yeah.
When God's taught you something, it's time to learn, not
Yes.
rebel again and buck against it again to try to, prove that you're right or whatever you've lost in the Samaria.
That lesson was the one repeated by the Philistines in 1 Samuel 6 when they had control of the Ark of the Covenant. They even say that. I mean, it's just, they said, why should you harden your hearts as the Egyptians and Pharaoh hardened their hearts? After he dealt severely with them, did they not send the people away and they departed? Now that leaves out the Red Sea thing. But from their perspective, they said, well, their problems ended when Israel, they don't do like he did. Centuries later, that point's made. Hey.
Like David said, when
Mm-hmm.
Think soberly, Titus,
Right.
1 Peter 5:8, be sober, be vigilant. God was trying to teach me a lesson,
Yeah.
and I rebelled,
We tend to not want to keep going with it. We tend to not want to listen.
Right.
That's right.
I'm always wrong and he's always right.
That's it. So one thing to mention this too, and this goes back to, you remember the two things remembered, there were the two memorials. There was Passover and there was the sacrifice of the firstborn, right? And it remembered the two aspects of the Israelite deliverance, both that you were saved and that Egypt was destroyed. Pairing those two together are important to do. It's not just will God saves, and it's not just will God obliterates. Both happen, right? Both are essential elements of God's relationship with his people. And we tend to want to, go to one side or the other. I say we, just generally people want to do that. They both have to be taken together. If you're an Israelite, and God has been promising to your most ancient ancestors for centuries that he will take you out of Egyptian bondage. After 4 centuries plus of Egyptian bondage, then God does it. And even as Mike mentioned, I think last time or time before, to the very day of it, there's more evidence. Okay, this, there's something to Yahweh. And by something, I mean there's everything to him, right? This is the God to worship and to follow. He's the only one. None of the Egyptian gods had been able to do anything like that. This Yahweh could. The Israelites are out of Egypt and they're not free. They're marching along as an army, right? Whose army? Not their own. They're God's now. Where are they going? They're not just going to blithely go to the promised land. They're going to Sinai. They're going to receive the reinstatement, or really the official, kind of the covenant and the law, and they're going to be kind of officially made God's people. We're going to build a tabernacle. We're going to have high priests. We're going to have all those things. They are set free from Egypt, but they are not free in the largest sense of the word. They're now servants of God instead of servants of Pharaoh. The idea of God using unexpected means to save his people, that's certainly a lesson I think you have to take from that. He usually chooses methods that defy reason and possibility, and I think that's just one of his hallmarks. Something that they're going to do later as a people is reenact this event. When they cross the Jordan River to go into the land of Canaan, they're going to do the same thing. God's going to lower the water and separate it, and they're going to pass through on dry land, right? As the trip began, so it's going to end. So Joshua 3 and 4, you're going to see that happen also. Speaking of how this is used again later, I did want to read one of these with you. This is Isaiah 43. Start with me, if you will, in verse 14. Isaiah 43:14. I'm going to read this one, and then I have to go to the connections to Jesus because I will not sleep well if I don't talk about those. Isaiah 43 and verse 14. This is centuries later. Darren mentioned, right? Learning the lesson and then forgetting. Learning the lesson and then forgetting. That's Israel in a nutshell. They learned it and then they forgot. Well, eventually they forgot until God threw them into Babylon for exile for a while. Isaiah 43 describes bringing them out. Notice the language. 43 and verse 14. Thus says the Lord, your Redeemer, the Holy One of Israel, for your sake I send to Babylon and bring them all down as fugitives, even the Chaldeans in the ships in which they rejoice. I am the Lord your Holy One, the Creator of Israel, your King. Thus says the Lord, who makes a way in the sea, a path in the mighty waters, who brings forth chariot and horse, army and warrior. They lie down, they cannot rise, they are extinguished, quenched like a wick. What's the imagery? It's the Red Sea crossing. The God who not only divided the water and brought his people through, but by way, the situation kind of coaxed Pharaoh to come and chase him into the water. And then the language of extinguished like a wick, right? God's going to do the same thing for his people again. That same sort of language of him being the God of the Red Sea crossing is used again to describe what he's going to eventually do with Babylon one day. Oh, bother! I need another hour. Uh, if you haven't ever seen this yet, 1 Corinthians 10 uses the language of the Red Sea crossing, and it specifically ties baptism to that idea. Right? For I do not want you to be unaware, brothers, 1 Corinthians 10 verse 1. I don't want you to be unaware, brothers, that our fathers were all under the cloud and all passed through the sea, and all were baptized into Moses in the cloud and in the sea, and all ate the same spiritual food, and all drank the same spiritual drink, for they drank from the spiritual rock that followed them, and that rock was Christ. Nevertheless, with most of them God was not pleased, for they were overthrown in the wilderness. Verses 1 to 5 in 1 Corinthians isn't only about the Red Sea crossing. There's a lot thrown in there from the wilderness wandering as a whole. But you notice the language that Paul starts with. They were under the cloud and passed through the sea and were baptized into Moses. In a sense, they went down into the water and they came out and they were now God's people, and they were now led by God's representative Moses to them, right? We're in that same situation with Jesus. Paul goes on. These things took place as examples for us, that we might not desire evil as they did. Right? So again, the idea of learn from their mistakes, and you're going to see that as you move further through 1 Corinthians. Again, a really good thing to think about later on. There are a lot of those. I'm going to talk about Jesus. The connections to Jesus, I think, are pretty powerful because Jesus begins his ministry in the same way. Right? At 30, he goes to John the Baptist and he's baptized, Matthew 3. And then after that, he begins being something else. He was always Jesus before and after. But at the baptism, he begins his ministry in earnest. It's immediately after he's baptized. He's taken where? Into the wilderness to be tempted. That sounds familiar. The same thing Israel did with the Red Sea and the wilderness following, Jesus does when he begins his ministry. He goes into the water, he comes out, and then he begins his special walk there. He teaches his own disciples to do the very same thing with those who would be servants of Christ later. Right? He teaches them to baptize people, to start people on their journey the same way he started his, the same way Israel started theirs. Right? By passing through water and being reborn in that sort of language. Any other connections to Jesus you can think of? Yeah.
So in verse 14, chapter 14, it says, the Lord is going to fight for you while you're remaining silent. And Jesus and God, they've already fought with us, like they've already fought the war.
Yes.
So all we have to do is follow them, right?
Yes.
But they've already won this war, and we're just seeing
They have done all of the difficult parts. What's our task? It's the walking, the following, the trusting in that. Don't miss this either. Hosea 11 and verse 1, the connection between him and Jesus. Out of Egypt I called my son. Right? You remember Jesus as an infant or as a child is sent into Egypt by way of the threat from Herod, and then he leaves Egypt. He comes back kind of in the same way Israel does. The word that's used in Luke 9 to describe Jesus' departure on the Mount of Transfiguration is the Greek term exodus, which just means to leave. That's why, exit is still the word for us today for leaving somewhere. Same word was used for Jesus and what he was about to do on the cross. Okay, no time for that. Next week, let's do the song. It's called the Song of the Sea, Exodus 15, the first 21 verses. I want to spend time with that because normally, like all poetry in the Bible, it gets sort of skipped. I don't want to do that. I want to spend some time with it. So we're going to do that next week, and then we'll carry on after that. All right. Thank you, guys.